Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to JASA's last webinar of the spring and early summer season. I'm really delighted today to have us here, Naomi Pollock, who will be talking to us about the Japanese house. JASA has not had very many talks on Japanese architecture, so I think we will learn a lot and be captivated by Naomi, who is an architect and journalist and has written many books. Without any further palaver, I turn the microphone over to Naomi. Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you, Allison. And thank you, JASA, for making this event today possible. It's really an honor to be able to talk to you and share my passion for Japanese houses with this wonderful audience. My plan today is to start by telling you a little bit about myself, and then tell you a little bit about how my book came about and explain how it's structured, and then take you inside its pages so we can look at some of the houses. Well, as some of the people in this audience know, I married into a family with deep connections to Japan. But when my husband and I moved to Japan in the 80s, it was up to me. I made it very clear I wanted to make my own relationship with Japan. I was already a practicing architect in New York, and it was clear that I could do a nice lateral shift and enter a firm in Tokyo. But I reasoned that that would give me a lot of knowledge of that one firm. And frankly, I didn't know anything about Japan, let alone its buildings. So instead, I applied and received a scholarship from the Ministry of Education, which enabled me to become a graduate student for the second time, this time at Tokyo University. And I have a very vivid memory of my first meeting with my advisor, who was Professor Hiroshi Hara. At that time, there were only 2 practicing architects on the faculty at Todai, so naturally, I wanted to work with one of them. And this meeting took place in his seminar room, which was in the old Seiken building in the Todai's sort of satellite campus in Nogizaka, where the National Arts Center is now positioned. And so we were sitting in his seminar room, which is this very long, skinny room, and has a very long, skinny table down the middle. And we sat in the middle, he on one side, and I was on the other side. And he turned to me and said in his very monotone Japanese, "So what is it you want to study?" And I said to him shyly that I wanted to know why Japanese buildings looked so strange. Because to my American eyes, I really was quite confused by what I was seeing. You know, buildings didn't seem to have any relationship to each other. They didn't have shared cornice lines, material compatibility. There were very few urban gestures that bound them together. And you know, don't get me started on the roofs. They were a crazy jumble of different shapes and neon, and I really couldn't make heads or tails of it. So Professor Hara, without skipping a beat, said, "Well, if you want to understand the contemporary situation, you really need to look at history." And that made a lot of sense to me. I was a classics and archaeology major undergrad, so I was pretty happy to look back at history. And I ended up doing my research and writing my master's thesis on Minka farmhouses, which, as you probably know, are these magnificent handmade houses up and down the Japanese archipelago, many of them topped with spectacular thatch roofs. So I was very happy to spend my days with these houses, but it didn't scratch that fundamental itch. What was going on in the contemporary arena? Well, I learned soon that Japan has a marvelous custom of when an architect finishes a building, they often will host a kengakukai, or open house, 2 or 3 days before they give the project over to their client. And they invite everyone they know, their colleagues, their friends, their families, their professors. They invite journalists, and academics and students like me. And you come to these things and you take off your shoes and you put on little white gloves because you can't leave a single mark in this pristine building. So I made it my own private curriculum to go to as many of these open houses as I could. And needless to say, I got up to speed pretty quickly. At the time, the Japanese economy was going gangbusters, full disclosure, this was the bubble period. And so Japan was building like nobody's business. And people outside Japan really wanted to know about what was going on. This was the pre-internet days, so print journalism was the source of information. So I was definitely in the right place at the right time. And I started writing while I was still a student. My first article was called Letter Home from Tokyo, and that was published in Metropolis magazine in New York. Since that time, I've written, this is my 10th book, and literally hundreds of articles, both on Japanese architecture and design. Well, this book started with a very straightforward idea. Shortly after one of my previous books, Japanese Design Since 1945, which features various products created in Japan of different design varieties. It has textiles, graphics, furniture, tableware, all kinds of things in there. But I felt it needed a companion, which was to cover houses for the same period. And I had this idea that if I could take approximately 100 of the most impactful houses designed by architects in Japan between 1945 and the present, what would that list look like? Which houses would be on it? Quoting from the foreword that Tadao Ando wrote for the book, I wanted to reveal the unbroken chain of creativity. And that was that creativity as it was exemplified in Japanese houses. Well, that basic idea, timeline, gave me the structure of the book. It is divided into 9 chapters, each one corresponding to a decade. Within each chapter, there are profiles of houses I selected as being qualifying as impactful and important and having a lasting meaning in Japan. And those profiles include my texts, as well as an array of photos and drawings that were made at the time of completion of the house. So what I was looking for, of course, were novel ideas, but what I really wanted were the thoroughbreds, not the zebras. Yet more than architectural concepts or construction technology, what really fascinated me was what was the atmosphere like in these houses? What was it like to be there, to actually live there? Well, to investigate this, I obviously needed to talk to people. So wherever possible, I spoke with the architect. But in many cases, the architects were already had already died. So I needed to look elsewhere. Sometimes that meant talking to their former students or their former staff members. In some cases, I talked to academics or architecture critics. I spoke with family members. I spoke with clients. And in one case, I spoke with the client's housekeeper. All of the people I spoke to shared wonderful anecdotes, descriptions, and memories of these buildings. And those ideas, those thoughts they shared, those stories infused my writing. Another way that I got at this idea of the experience of these houses was to invite a series of essayists. They correspond to the decades, to write about the house that they lived in, So oftentimes this was the child of the architects who were now grown, or sometimes it was the architects themselves, and sometimes it was the client. Um, for example, we have a wonderful essay written by Michiko Uchida, who describes her childhood home designed by her father, Kenzo Tange. Fumihiko Maki and his daughter shared stories of the two-generation house that Mr. Maki had built initially for his own nuclear family and his parents, and more recently, the house has been occupied by Mr. Maki and his wife and his daughter, Naomi, and her family. With the passing of Mr. Maki just a couple days ago, this essay feels even more precious to me. Another was written by an architect named Katsuhiro Miyamoto. And his situation was slightly different in that he wrote about a house that belonged to his family, had been in his family since the early 20th century. And it's located in Hyogo-ken, Hyogo Prefecture. So when the Great Hanshin earthquake struck in 1995, the house was heavily damaged. And the government, in their usual way, came and said, well, we'll just tear it down. And initially, Miyamoto kind of accepted that. And then he did a complete about face and said, absolutely not. If this house that has been, it's been in my family since my grandparents' time, if it goes, it takes the memories and so much family history with it. So instead, he bandaged it with a hulking white steel frame that is both visible outside and inside the house, and then appropriately renamed it House Surgery. Well, I also asked each of these essayists to illustrate their essays with informal snapshots from their own collections. So these two show the homes in action and being used, and they enrich the understanding of how these houses were experienced. But the bulk of the 544 illustrations in this book had to be unearthed by myself with the help of a photo sourcer. Now, there is no central archive in Japan with a comprehensive collection of architectural photography. There are different libraries that have collections, and then there are individual archives, but there's no one-stop shopping situation. So at times the process of looking for these images was really quite tortured, but mostly it was a real treasure hunt. My goal was to create a parallel narrative, a narrative that paralleled the text, but was visual. And as I said, I only used existing images. So at the start of the book, the photos are black and white, the drawings are done by hand, and by the end, it's computer data and color photos. Among the photos you'll see in the book are many iconic images, perhaps photos you've even seen before, like this one that's on the cover of the book from Kazuo Shinohara's umbrella house. I'll get to that in a little bit. But a lot of the photos that we unearthed have been long forgotten, and some of them had never even been published. So that was pretty exciting to be able to do that. Well, one question I'm often asked is, why does the book begin in 1945? Well, obviously that was the year that the war ended, and therefore Reconstruction in Japan started. And there was a lot to reconstruct. Physically, the loss of homes was absolutely catastrophic, and there was an urgent need to rebuild. Yet there was a paucity of money and materials. Now, this was partly offset by loans offered by the government for people who wanted to rebuild their homes. But those loans came with a number of restrictions. Well, 1945 was also a time of great political and social change in Japan, many of these changes having a strong influence on design, especially of houses. Among the most critical was the shift from the traditional multi-generation home living under the aegis of a patriarch in one building or one collection of buildings. That was traded out for the nuclear family, modeled on the Western idea of a couple and 2 children. Another significant change was the separation of sleeping and eating. In the traditional house, these activities usually occurred in the same room. It was easy. You just swapped, in futon and could convert any space into a sleeping space. But after the war, this was deemed by policymakers as unhygienic. So the two had to be separated. Well, for architects, it was a great opportunity to modernize the home, this big need for homes. But perhaps even more than that, it was a chance to rethink what the house could actually be. What could it be made of? What would it look like? And how would it function? One of the early, pioneering architects in the immediate post-war period was an architect named Kiyoshi Ikebe. And he had a number of major points that he stressed in his designs. One was he promoted putting the kitchen in the center of the house. This was a very bold statement and a real departure from the past, because previously kitchens were, very sort of subservient spaces that were tucked away in dark corners, or sometimes even in the transitional space between inside and out. But Ikebe's idea was put it in the center of the house where it can be a place for the family to gather. And it also was a perfect answer to this issue of separating sleeping and eating. So what you see on the screen is Ikebe's number 1. He never gave his homes numbers. He just names. He just numbered them. And this house was built in 1948 in compliance with the government loans that I mentioned. One of the restrictions were the materials that could be used. So what you see here are wood, concrete block, and glass, which were relatively affordable and relatively attainable at the time. Another restriction had to do with size. Around this time, the size restrictions were about 540 square feet, or roughly a small New York studio apartment. But to Ikebe, this small size was really not a hardship. And I had a lengthy conversation with his daughter, Konomi, who is also in the design profession. She's an urban planner. And she explained that her father was very inspired by tea house architecture. And as you may know, tea houses are these very compact spaces, very efficiently organized, intended for the express purpose of tea being prepared, served, and savored. And everything is close at hand, so they're very cozy and they function very well. So that was the idea that Ikebe had in mind when he created houses like this one. Another item to note about this house, if you look on the left, you see that the roof, and therefore the ceiling, is slanted. And this was a very simple gesture that enabled him to make the most of a small footprint. For one thing, tilting the roof enabled the communal spaces on the ground floor to have some sense of hierarchy or separation, because the ceiling height varied in different places. But it also enabled him to make a tiny mezzanine level, which you see all the way on the upper right and that left image. And that is where he placed the bedrooms. So he could even create a sense of privacy in this tiny house. Well, by the 1950s, the immediate crisis had waned. the restrictions had loosened, and commissions for architects had begun to expand. What you see here is a house, sky house, that was designed and built in 1958 by an architect named Kiyonori Kikutake. And he initially designed this house for him and his wife. And as you can see, it's a very simple idea. There's one big square room supported and elevated by these massive concrete piers, one on each, in the middle of each side, and then wrapped with a covered porch, very similar to an engawa. Inside, it was essentially one big room that he divided with furniture and movable partitions, like you see all the way on the right, the sliding shoji screens there. So this big space was also augmented by movable boxes called move nets that Kiyonori Kikutake invented. And one contained the kitchen and one contained the bathroom. And as their name suggests, these were actually movable boxes. How often they actually moved is something I really am not sure about. It couldn't have been easy, but they were designed to be able to slide into different positions around the perimeter of the house. Well, as the family grew and children were born, there was a need for more space, which meant more move nets. This time, Kikutake suspended boxes from the floor, that square floor I showed you. And here we are looking into his daughter's bedroom. And she was delighted to see this slide. She'd never seen it before. And she told me it was such a fantastic little room for her as a child, with all of her possessions close by, and her window was very cozy, and she loved this room. Well, by the 1960s, Japan was solidly on the up and up. The country was gearing up to host the 1964 Olympics in Tokyo, and the economy was going great guns, and consumers had disposable income. This prosperity gave rise to all kinds of consumer goods. The TV, refrigerator, and washing machine became famously known as the three sacred treasures. But this also meant that people could now afford homes that did more than answer basic needs. As the architect Kazuo Shinohara said, a house can be a work of art. And what you see here is the same house that's on the cover. It's Umbrella House, designed by Shinohara in 1961. And it really is a great illustration of his statement about a house as a work of art. So at this stage in his career, Shinohara was building a lot of houses, and he was really grappling with the idea of how do we blend traditional Japanese homes with contemporary modernism. And so this is the interior of Umbrella House, and you can see a number of very traditional elements. There's the ladder right there leading up to a little alcove or attic space. There are on the left, you see the Fusuma sliding opaque paper partitions that separate the sleeping area. In the foreground, you can see a sudare shade, which would normally have been to block the sun on the outside, but here is used as a bit of a room divider. And then, of course, there are the spoke-like beams resembling an umbrella that support the roof. Now, in the houses I was studying as a master's student, many of them had very impressive roof structures, but usually it was more of a three-dimensional matrix kind of shape, and the trees were left very much, they were planed down, but they were left very much in their natural shape. Here, Shinohara was making a very conscious effort to make it look like an umbrella, and they all point into the middle where a ring secures them at the top there. So, but as I said, he was also looking for modernism. And in this image, you can see that the house was actually quite light, it had quite a bit of daylight, which was not always a common occurrence. He used white for the walls, and of course, he provided a state-of-the-art kitchen. But one of the most compelling houses in the book is this one. It's called White U. It was designed by Toyo Ito in 1976. And he created this house for his sister and her two daughters shortly after the death of her husband and their father. In order to nurture and support the grieving family, Ito conceived of the house as a U-shaped tube of concrete that was fairly closed to the environment. It does ring a dirt-covered courtyard, but that courtyard was not a place that they went outside. It was more a visual focus from the limited number of windows that were carved into or set into this concrete tube. Within the house, there were partitions where needed to separate private rooms, but a lot of the public rooms just flowed effortlessly from one to the other, the entrance to the living room to the dining room, etc. And there were some skylights and some windows, but basically it was a very insular, inward-focused home. Well, after 20 years, the daughters had grown up, and the trio no longer felt the need to live in a house that was conceived out of a sense of loss. At the same time, they couldn't imagine anyone else living in a place so personal to them. So the house was torn down in 1977, or sorry, 1997. Built in 1976, torn down in 1997. Well, it is strange to think that a house made of concrete would be demolished after just 21 years. But actually, that's not that unusual in Japan. The average lifespan is closer to 26 or so years, which is quite an astounding fact to sort of wrap one's head around. Well, for better or for worse, the short lifespan of houses, of course, generates work for architects. But the reasons for the short life of houses are manyfold. High inheritance taxes. Many families can't afford to keep the house when it passes from one generation to the next. The inheritance taxes are just too high, so they have to sell it, or sometimes they'll tear it down and sell a portion of the land and rebuild. Various, ways of doing that. A lot of times the houses aren't built that well, and so after one generation of family life, they really show signs of wear and tear. But another reason that houses are sometimes sacrificed are the various urban renewal projects that go on in Tokyo. This is a picture of a house called Gazebo. It was built by and it is occupied by Riken Yamamoto, who was this year's Pritzker Prize laureate. And this home resulted after a road widening. Previously, the street in front was a narrow shop-lined road. And probably in the run-up to the Olympics, the government got an idea to widen the road. But in that effort, they had to tear down these rows of houses and shops. And not only were the buildings lost, but the whole sense of community that comes from having a street where people go in and banter with the shopkeeper and then go out and gossip with their neighbors and then go and buy their vegetables. That whole way of life was one of the aspects that went when they tore down the buildings. And among the shops that had been on that street was Yamamoto's parents' pharmacy with their house attached. So he really wanted to recreate. He knew that recreating that sense of pedestrian life was not going to be easy. The road is big, the cars are many, but trying to do something that would give back and to the idea of community was first and foremost on his mind. So this is actually, the home is actually at the top of this building. It's, I think, 4 stories high. The ground floor initially held, again, the pharmacy as well as a cafe to engage pedestrians, to bring people inside, to have conversations. And then the home that Yamamoto created for his family at the top, as you see, centers around a courtyard shown here in this photo, which is really another form of community, just at a residential scale. Well, I do believe that the importance that Yamamoto places on the idea of community, of drawing people in, drawing people together, is something that pervades many, many of his works. And I do think that that's one of the reasons he was given the Pritzker Prize this year. Another Pritzker Prize winner is Shigeru Ban, who designed and built this house in 1995. It's called Paper House, and it was built ostensibly as his own weekend house. But the architect will be the first to tell you that he didn't really use it. He's too busy in the office or jetting off to his Paris atelier or going to a disaster site where he has done many, many, many temporary buildings. And the real purpose of building this was to demonstrate that the lowly paper tube was strong enough to hold up a roof. And by doing this, he proved his point. So since then, he's been able to use paper tube construction for buildings of many different sizes, many different purposes, and in countries all over the world. As I said, including humanitarian projects, because paper tubes are made in countries all over the world and they're relatively inexpensive. So they're very quick and easy building material. Well, here they form an S-shaped wall. This is the floor plan, so you're looking down at the floor, and those little circles making the S shape are the paper tubes, as if you sort of cut them at 1 meter off the ground. And as you can see in the upper left corner, they circle around. That's the bathtub, which has its own little garden. And then they flip around, and then on the upper right, separated by sliding partitions, were the sleeping quarters. Down the middle they're really sort of 2 sleeping areas with closets, which are those squares down the middle, dividing the 2 sleeping areas. And then they open out the house at the bottom. They open the public area out to the landscape, as you can see here, which was something that matters a lot, that Ban works on a lot, blurring this boundary between inside and out. It's a very classic traditional Japanese idea, and it's one that Ban finds extremely compelling, and he uses it a lot. He also really likes architecture that has moving parts. So this entire square house is enclosed with sliding screens, which of course they're actually glass, which of course were inspired by Shoji students. Another non-urban example that I want to call to your attention is this one. It's called the 4x4 house. And I want to tell you about it because it has a very unusual beginning. The story goes like this. In 2001, Brutus, which is a very popular magazine, general interest kind of magazine, held a contest. And the contest was, they asked readers to submit on a postcard the name of their dream architect. If picked, the reader would supply land and pay for construction, but the magazine would negotiate and supply the architect. Well, the winner of this contest was a construction company executive with a tiny property overlooking the Seto Inland Sea. It's kind of between Kobe, on the outskirts of Kobe. And his big wish was to have a home designed by Tadao Ando. Well, as you can see here, Ando responded with a concrete mini tower topped with a 4-meter square cube. The private rooms are occupied the 3 stories below with, that means bedrooms. I think there's a study, bathrooms, and so forth. And then the cube holds the public rooms, the shared, the communal rooms, the living, dining, kitchen. And as you can see from this picture looking out, that was a good choice because the higher you go, the better the view, the better the light, the less intrusion by the cars that race by on the highway in the back of the house. And when I visited this house, I had a chance to meet the client, and I was pretty direct with him. And I said, so, what's it like carrying heavy bags of groceries up 4 floors? And he just smiled and said, it's worth the price of admission to get this view and here in this space and be living in an Ando house. While challenging city sites offer chances to push limits in other ways. This house, it's called House in a Plum Grove, is located in Tokyo and was designed by Kazuyo Sejima. She created the house for a couple with 2 kids, 1 live-in grandmother, and a very small plot that had been dotted with plum trees. They wanted to keep the plum trees, so they were removed during construction. This photo was taken right after the house was finished, and then replanted afterwards in that slot of, an L-shaped slot of land you see between the telephone poles. And kind of typical conditions on one side, you can see there's a small parking lot, and the other on the right, you can't really see it so clearly, but that's a small playground. So, faced with a tiny site, most architects' knee-jerk reaction is, let's use as few walls as possible, try to make the biggest rooms we can. But Sejima went in the opposite direction. She reasoned that the more rooms, the better. So this poker-faced exterior, it's made of thin steel sheets, which again was another way of saving precious inches and centimeters, conceals 3 stories. And these 3 levels hold a variety of communal spaces, including a library, a tea room, and a rooftop bathroom, plus individual mini rooms for each of the family members, most of them barely bigger than the furniture they hold. So you see here the son in his bedroom, which is literally the width of his bed. Maybe the high ceiling height, it runs the height of the house, compensates partly. Certainly the large window on the left alleviates a sense of claustrophobia. And on the right at the top there, you see another opening, and that's an internal, it has no glass, it's just an opening in a wall opening that connects him to his sister's study, which is of course the size of her desk, but it allows sound to travel and paper airplanes and whatever kids want to toss between them. So by connecting the spaces in this way, instead of isolating them, that, as I said, it alleviates a sense of claustrophobia and creates even a sense of community, despite the fact that the space is so divided. Well, in closing, I want to leave you with one more house. And this is called House Restaurant. It was built in 2022. It was designed by an architect named Junya Ishigami, who is unquestionably one of the most fearless designers at work in Japan today. I recently wrote an article about a museum he designed in China that is a kilometer long. A kilometer long. But returning to this building was a commission from a return client. So the client knew what he was getting himself into. He's a chef, and he had land in Yamaguchi Prefecture at the very end of Honshu. And what he wanted was a single building that combined his home and his restaurant and had the atmosphere of a wine cellar. Well, instead of building upward with the usual columns and beams or walls, Ishigami dug holes in the earth, massive holes in the earth, which became molds for poured-in-place concrete. Well, this was a very daring strategy because he really had no idea what kind of space he was creating until the concrete had been poured, which was a pretty quick job, cured, took about a month, and then all the dirt was excavated. Only then did he get his eureka moment. Fortunately, both client and architect were thrilled with the results. Ishigami had originally planned to smooth off this rough concrete and coat it with some kind of transparent coating. But when he saw this craggy surface with bits of rust-colored earth stuck to it, he said, no, 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 we're keeping this. And so they just simply coated that with a transparent sealant. And then he poured a smooth floor plate, so it does have a smooth floor made of concrete, and then used laser cutters to create glass panels that sit perfectly between these rough concrete, I guess you'd call them sort of piers, arches, something like that. Well, one side of the building contains the home, and here is just a glimpse of that. It's the family bathroom. Of course, the tub is sunken in the ground. And you can see in the back of the slide, there is one of these large windows which looks out at a little patch of greenery. He wanted to consider those views very carefully. And the other side of the building contains the restaurant. And here you see the counter where patrons sit while the chef cooks in front of them and carries on conversation. Again, you can see the glass, and basically the house is sunken, or the building is sunken. So the side walls where the earth goes back up is visible, and he was very conscientious in how he planted these to make it appealing for diners as well as the family. In between the restaurant and the residential portion, he placed 3 courtyards, and these are open to the sky, so they bring natural light and fresh air into both halves of the buildings. And they also separate them, create a bit of a buffer so that there's more privacy for the family. Well, this is just a small sampling of the houses that are contained in the book. I really invite you to take a look at the others. As you'll see, each house tells a special story about the time when it was built, about the place that molded its form, and above all, about the people who brought it to life and made it a home. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I'm very happy to take your questions.
Naomi, thank you very much. I am fortunate enough to have bought the book in advance, and so having grown up in Japan, I was thinking that I might recognize some of the houses. I don't. You mentioned that the average lifespan of a house is 26 years, so obviously that means that several of them are no longer available to be seen. We do have a number of questions, so I think I'll start on those. One of the first questions is, what is zoning like in Japan?
Zoning, well, there's definitely zoning. A lot of the zoning is of course driven by health and safety. So in terms of ceiling, building heights for how I'm thinking, of course, about residential areas. And one of the key elements, and this is why there's so many single family homes independent, is that all homes must have direct access to the street so an emergency vehicle can get to them. So you see these slightly peculiar, there's several of them in the book, of these flag-shaped sites that are permitted with the zoning code. You can build on them, but they have to have that flag pole that connects bigger portion of the property to roads. It's hard to sort of, there's zoning codes and their building codes, and they get a little bit intermingled. But basically, they are quite forgiving, except completely uncompromising where safety is concerned. And of course, this is a country that has earthquakes, that has had a very sad history with fire. So those things are constantly a concern. Houses have to have a set distance apart. They have to be separated because they don't want fire to transfer from one to the other.
You're an architect yourself, I know, and we wondered, how does Japanese, this is going to be maybe a long answer, how does Japanese architecture different from architecture in the West? It's not simply the use of different materials. It seems like there's a lot of concrete being used in Japan.
Well, especially focusing on houses again, the architecture of any place is going to be particular to that place. So even as, Tokyo's getting more and more skyscrapers built by international architects, houses will remain particular to Japan. What makes them particular? Again, it comes back to people and how people want to live. That's the fundamental difference. The things that people value in homes in Japan remain different from the things that people value outside of Japan. For example, the idea of privacy is something that is conceived of completely differently. For a long time, and this is changing slowly, people really did not invite non-family members into their homes. So there was this very clear demarcation between inside the house and outside the house. But within the home, that sense of division is very, very, I don't want to use the word weak, but that's not something that matters. People want to hear the presence of their family members. They want to have contact with family members. They do not want doors that close and create rigid boundaries. So that's a big one. There are other lifestyle aspects that, Japan is still in many ways floor-based homes are still the norm, and that's very different. In terms of materials, well, yes, there's a lot of concrete. Until fairly recently, at least in Tokyo, people couldn't build with wood. Again, it gets back to the idea that trying to prevent fire from destroying homes. So concrete became a very popular material. In terms of what the functional elements, the idea, I know what I was going to say. Size is obviously a huge difference, and homes in Japan tend to be much smaller than they are in other places, especially the United States. But people don't perceive them as small, because the value of having a large space the value we have placed on large spaces in America does not exist in Japan. in many ways, it gets back to that idea of the tea house that Ikebe was talking about, the preference of having things close at hand, the convenience. And so there's no wish to have a bigger home. We don't have to feel sorry that people are living in small homes. This is the way they want to live.
Perusing the book, it really seemed like a wonderful grouping of many, many famous architects' names. And, Japanese architects are famous in the world now. But once you completed the book, were there any artists that you realized, oh, I didn't put this person in?
Well, yes. And I managed to get references to people elsewhere. That was partly the case, but it was more a case of, oh, I wish I'd also included that house. So I might have already had houses by certain architects, but then I was like, ugh, why didn't I also put in that house? And, you have to draw the line somewhere. So.
And then our final question is, do you see Japanese female architects being as recognized as their male counterparts?
Well, that's definitely changing. When I was a student, I would say half of my cohort were Japanese women. Among those women, I'm not sure how many of them are still in practice. And then there was a phase where there were lots of couples in practice.
Mm-hmm.
And but that meant that when the Hoikuen, daycare center was closing, it was usually the wife that went to pick up the child. So even though they were in practice together, that doesn't necessarily mean that the division of labor was even. What I have seen increasingly are women having their own firms. And that's very exciting. And there's one woman in particular, one of her houses in the book, Yuko Nagayama, and I've had many conversations with her over the years about how do you blend child rearing and architecture. And it was very interesting because she had an office originally, it was really on the outskirts of Tokyo, in a kind of nondescript apartment building. And lo and behold, she's married, she has a baby. What is she gonna do with the baby? Well, she can't get her child into the local daycare center. Okay, so then what happens? She rented the apartment next door and installed, I think at first it was her mother and maybe eventually it was a babysitter, to have the child there. And then she could go and be with the child, nurse the child. She said the iPad made her life, her professional life, possible because she could just pick up her work and take it with her. So these things are getting worked out.
But are women and men accepted in equal numbers to architectural programs, would you say, or?
Yes, definitely. I mean, at my time they were, I'm sure that's only improved.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. And this has been a wonderful talk. We will have a link to the book in the follow-up email for everybody. Naomi, I would like to thank you very, very much for joining us today. We look forward to other books that I'm sure that you are working on right now.
Yes, of course.
And for people who are listening in, even though this is our last webinar before we all go into summer mode, the JASA Program Committee never sleeps. We have a little trip to the Noguchi Museum next Thursday at 1 o'clock. It's in Long Island City. And then July 12th through the 14th, JASA has planned a special trip to Houston where the final iteration of Meiji Modern will take place. The show opens July 9th and runs until September 15th. So we do hope that you will go and see our 50th anniversary milestone exhibition. And July 19th, we also have a trip to DC, and details of that will be in your inboxes on your email very, very soon. So everybody, thank you very much for joining us, and happy summer.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Naomi.